April 8, 1943. The sky over northern France was a crystal dome of blue at 27,000 feet. In the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Herrmachen tightened his oxygen mask and allowed himself a smirk. He and his fellow Luftwaffe aces were circling high, confident hunters looking down on their prey. Below, 16 bulky American fighters were struggling to climb toward them. Their enormous shapes looked almost ridiculous against the elegance of the German fighters. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, barrel-shaped, thick-winged, and crowned with a greenhouse canopy, seemed like some awkward farm animal that had accidentally taken to the skies. Flying milk bottles, Herrmachen chuckled over the radio to his wingman. The channel filled with German laughter. To them, these new American machines were clumsy intruders, a poor imitation of real fighters. The Luftwaffe pilots had reason to laugh. By 1943, they were hardened by years of combat over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. Many of them had dozens of victories marked on the tails of their aircraft. The Americans, by contrast, were rookies. The P-47 was only just making its combat debut over Europe. These young Yanks were flying a machine they barely understood, against opponents who had been at war since 1939. Yet, in that laughter, in that easy confidence, lay the seeds of a rude awakening. None of those German pilots circling above could have guessed that the very machine they mocked would become one of the most feared weapons of the entire war. Because hidden inside that bulky frame was a monster. 2,000 horsepower of Pratt Whitney engine, a turbocharger that gave it lungs in the stratosphere, and 850 caliber Browning machine guns capable of shredding anything that crossed their path. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't pretty. But the P-47 Thunderbolt was about to teach the Luftwaffe a brutal lesson. In modern war, survival favored not elegance, but endurance, firepower, and the industrial muscle to build thousands more. This, then, is the story of how a flying milk bottle turned the skies of Europe into a killing ground, how laughter turned to shock, and shock to fear. The Thunderbolt story did not begin in the skies over France, but in a quiet corner of New York in the summer of 1940, a moment of panic for the United States Army Air Corps. Europe was already in flames. German fighters swept across France with terrifying speed, and the Luftwaffe seemed unstoppable. The US and military, still tiny and ill-prepared, suddenly realized that the aircraft it had in service, the P-35s and P-36s, were hopelessly outdated. They needed something radical, something that could challenge the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s dominating Europe's skies. The challenge fell to a man who knew what it meant to flee tyranny. Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was a Georgian immigrant, driven from his homeland first by the Russians, then by war, and finally by the march of fascism in Europe. In America, he found refuge and a mission. As chief designer at Republic Aviation, he was tasked with creating a new high-altitude interceptor. The Army's requirements were bold. A fighter that could climb fast, fight at 25,000 feet, and carry heavy firepower. What Kartveli gave them, however, was something entirely different, something no one expected. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted to his design team, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." The prototype XP-47B rolled out in May 1941, and even hardened test pilots laughed when they saw it for the first time. Nearly 10,000 pounds empty weight, 65% heavier than its predecessor. A huge radial engine up front. A massive turbo supercharger that stretched down the fuselage, with ducting so large that mechanics joked you could crawl through it. To many, it looked like a pregnant beast. Some even doubted it could fly. But fly it did, and once airborne, it proved unlike anything else in the world. That 18-cylinder Pratt Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, feeding off its revolutionary turbo supercharger, delivered full sea-level power even at 27,000 feet. Where German engines gasped for oxygen, the P-47's heart roared like a locomotive in the sky. More than that, Kartveli had built it tough. This was no fragile racer, no nimble but delicate knife fighter. The Thunderbolt was a hammer, a machine designed to absorb punishment, deliver firepower, and bring its pilot home alive. In the sterile light of the design shop, few could imagine the battlefield that awaited, but Kartveli's monster would soon face its trial by fire. And though it would stumble at first, its brute strength would prove decisive. For now, the world still laughed at the ungainly giant, but the laughter would not last. Before the P-47 Thunderbolt ever faced German fire, it was already claiming victims, American ones. In the autumn of 1942, squadrons across the East Coast received their first shipments of the new fighter. On the flight line, pilots stared at the hulking machine and shook their heads. Many were young farm boys and college kids who had trained in nimble trainers or smooth P-40s. Now they were told to strap themselves into a 7-ton brute with an engine that sounded like it wanted to tear itself off the mounts. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, remembered those early days with dread. "We lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft before ever firing a shot in anger," he later admitted. The airplane killed more of us in training than the Germans did in the first months of combat. The problems were as terrifying as they were frequent. On takeoff, the enormous propeller's torque could flip the fighter over in a heartbeat. On landing, the heavy landing gear dug into soft runways, causing brutal ground loops that sent planes cartwheeling. And in high-speed dives, the P-47 introduced pilots to a deadly new phenomenon: compressibility. At near transonic speeds, shock waves froze the controls solid. More than one pilot found himself screaming into the ground, unable to pull out. The nickname Jug, short for Juggernaut, was meant as a term of respect. But in those early months, many pilots muttered another meaning under their breath. Jug, as in jug of milk, clumsy and useless. Doubt spread quickly. Reports from Britain's RAF, watching the Americans struggle, suggested the Thunderbolt was a mistake. British Spitfire pilots joked that the best way to escape danger in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the cockpit. It was that roomy. Inside the squadrons, morale was shaky. Letters home from young airmen revealed their frustration. "It climbs like a cow. It turns like a freight train. If this is our warhorse, I fear we'll be slaughtered." And indeed, the statistics were grim. In the first month of operations, American groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in combat for only 3 confirmed kills. The Luftwaffe, sharp and experienced, was already calling them meat for the slaughter. Yet something strange was happening that German intelligence failed to notice. Many Thunderbolts that returned from combat were riddled with holes. 20mm cannon shells had smashed through wings, hydraulic lines, even engines. Yet the planes somehow limped home. Mechanics counted over 100 bullet holes in a single aircraft that had still managed to land safely. The pilots grumbled. The Germans laughed. The British doubted. But the truth was already emerging. This machine, as unforgiving as it seemed, had been built for something no Spitfire or Messerschmitt could survive: absolute punishment. The tragedy of the training days was real, but the lesson would soon become clear. Once mastered, the Thunderbolt was not a liability. It was an indestructible beast waiting to be unleashed. April 1943. The day had finally come. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, big, heavy, and controversial, was about to meet its enemy in the skies over occupied France. The 4th Fighter Group, commanded by Major Donald Blakesley, took their machines into combat for the first time. For weeks, his men had drilled, tested, and cursed the P-47. Many still longed for the sleek Spitfires they had flown with the RAF's Eagle squadrons. Now they would discover whether the Thunderbolt was truly a fighter or a death trap. High above the French countryside, German formations were waiting. The Luftwaffe aces had been in combat for years, and they knew their craft. They were flying Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, fast, agile, proven killers. To their eyes, the Thunderbolt looked like a bloated target. The battle began quickly. Diving out of the sun, German fighters tore into the American formation. The rookie Thunderbolt pilots tried to turn with their opponents and discovered the painful truth. The P-47 simply could not match the nimble rolls and tight loops of the Luftwaffe machines. One German ace later sneered in his report, "It turns like a freight train, it climbs like a pregnant cow. They are fat targets, pretending to be warriors." He wasn't entirely wrong. In those first weeks, American losses were heavy. 14 Thunderbolts fell for just 3 confirmed kills. Morale sank, and whispers spread that perhaps the Army Air Forces had made a terrible mistake. But something else was happening. Something subtle, almost invisible at first. When a P-47 did manage to get its guns on target, the results were catastrophic. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns firing 3,400 rounds at a combined rate of 6,000 bullets per minute shredded German fighters in seconds. The Luftwaffe had never seen anything like it. Spitfires and early American fighters relied on rifle-caliber guns or small cannons with limited ammunition. But the Thunderbolt could sustain fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in aerial combat. A German fighter caught in that storm of lead rarely escaped intact. And then there was its toughness. Time and again, battered Thunderbolts limped back across the channel, scarred but alive. Mechanics counted cannon holes in wings, shredded control surfaces, shattered windshields. And yet the planes landed. One crew chief stopped counting after finding more than 200 bullet strikes in a single aircraft. The Germans still laughed, but the laughter was thinner now. Because behind the clumsy silhouette of the flying milk bottle was a machine that refused to die. For the American pilots, those first weeks were brutal. They lost friends, they lost faith, but they also began to learn. Blakesley drilled it into them. Don't turn with the Hun. Don't climb with him at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your dive. Use your firepower. It was a painful education, but one that would soon transform the P-47 from clumsy rookie to dominant predator. The baptism of fire had been costly, but out of it came the first glimpse of what the Thunderbolt could truly do. By the summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe had developed a cruel confidence about the P-47. They knew it couldn't turn like a Spitfire, couldn't climb like a Messerschmitt, and they mocked its ungainly size. To them, it was a fat, slow-moving target, a joke with wings. But slowly, quietly, reports began trickling back from the front that told a very different story. One Thunderbolt returned from a mission over France with its fuselage stitched by 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes. A British observer, watching it land, could hardly believe it. "Any other fighter would have broken up long ago," he remarked. Yet the P-47 rolled down the runway, engine still running strong, its pilot shaken but alive. Another time, a squadron maintenance crew stopped counting at 200 holes in a single jug, fuel tanks punctured, tail nearly shot off, half the control cables severed, and still it had flown home across the channel. What made the Thunderbolt so hard to kill? The answer was in its design. Its massive radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, lacked the fragile coolant systems that plagued liquid-cooled fighters like the German Messerschmitt 109 or the British Spitfire. A single bullet through a radiator could doom those aircraft within minutes. But the Thunderbolt's air-cooled radial could shrug off hits that would have silenced any inline engine. Then there was its armor. Kartveli and his engineers had insisted on heavy protection. Bulletproof glass in the canopy, armor plates behind the pilot's seat, reinforced spars in the wings, and a rugged fuselage that absorbed punishment like a prize fighter's jaw. The Thunderbolt weighed more than 7 tons when fully loaded, and much of that weight was steel and protection. German pilots, used to dueling with fragile opponents, were stunned. They poured fire into the Thunderbolt, only to watch it keep flying. One Luftwaffe ace compared it bitterly to trying to shoot down a flying battleship. And then came the firepower. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns didn't just shoot, they carved. Their combined fire rate unleashed a hurricane of lead, ripping through fuselages, wings, and cockpits with horrifying efficiency. One short burst could cut a Messerschmitt in half. This was the paradox of the P-47. On the outside, it looked like an overweight farm animal, but in reality, it was a flying fortress in fighter clothing. A plane that could take punishment like a B-17 and deliver destruction like no other single-seat fighter in the world. The Americans began to realize they had something special. If they could stop flying it like a Spitfire and start flying it like the Juggernaut it was, the results would be devastating. The lesson came into sharp focus on June 26, 1943, in a fight that would become legend and would cement the Thunderbolt's reputation forever. June 26, 1943. Over France. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron had already built a reputation as a steady farm boy from Oklahoma who could handle pressure. But nothing could have prepared him for the test he would face that day. His squadron of P-47s was returning from an escort mission when disaster struck. Out of the sun, 16 Focke-Wulf 190s pounced, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. It was a textbook ambush, swift and merciless. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying near the rear of the formation, was hit almost immediately. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage. His canopy shattered, spraying him with shards of plexiglass. Hydraulic fluid burst into the cockpit. Fire licked behind the instrument panel. His nose and leg were bleeding from shrapnel wounds. He tried to bail out, but fate had other plans. A 20mm shell had jammed the canopy shut, welding it to the frame. He was trapped inside a burning coffin at 27,000 feet. Smoke filled the cockpit. His engine shook violently, coughing oil across his windscreen. Control cables were frayed, instruments failing. Any other fighter would have gone down in flames, but the Thunderbolt kept flying. Somehow, impossibly, Johnson leveled his crippled aircraft and pointed it toward England. Then came the final torment. A lone Focke-Wulf spotted his wounded P-47 limping home. The German pilot closed in behind and opened fire with his 20mm cannon and machine guns. Johnson could do nothing but hunch behind his armor plate and pray. The shells ripped into the jug. Holes appeared everywhere. Wings, fuselage, tail. The German pressed in, emptying his entire ammunition load. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. Out of cannon shells, the enemy pilot switched to machine guns, hammering away until those too ran dry. He pulled alongside, staring in disbelief at the flying wreck beside him. Johnson could see his face. Blonde, young, confident at first, then confused, then almost fearful. In a gesture that has become legend, the German shook his head, raised his hand in a salute, and peeled away. He had thrown everything he had at the Thunderbolt, and it still refused to die. Johnson limped back across the channel, half blind behind his oil-smeared canopy. Somehow the jug carried him all the way to Manston Airfield in England. As he rolled to a stop, mechanics swarmed the aircraft. They began counting bullet holes but gave up after 200. 3 of the 4 main fuselage longerons, the very spine of the aircraft, had been shot through. The engine had taken direct hits. The control system was nearly severed. Yet the P-47 had done the impossible. It had brought its pilot home. Word spread like wildfire. American pilots whispered it with awe. German intelligence at first refused to believe the reports. No fighter can take that much punishment, they said, but testimony from both sides confirmed it. The lesson was clear. This was no milk bottle. This was no flying joke. The Thunderbolt could take the worst the Luftwaffe had to give and still come back swinging. From that day forward, Robert Johnson's story became a rallying cry. To German pilots, it was a warning. You could pour your guns dry into a jug, and it might still be there when you were out of ammunition. The laughter in the Luftwaffe mess halls was beginning to fade. By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt had proven it could take punishment. It had proven it could kill when its guns found their mark, but it still hadn't proven how to win consistently in combat. That would come only when American pilots stopped trying to turn it into something it wasn't. The turning point came under the leadership of men like Hub Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, and Donald Blakesley, leader of the 4th Fighter Group. Both were veterans, Zemke a tough, analytical North Dakotan, Blakesley a former Eagle Squadron ace who had flown Spitfires before transferring to the U.S. Army Air Forces. They understood something many of their younger pilots didn't yet grasp. The jug wasn't a knife. It was a hammer. The lesson was drilled into every briefing. Don't turn with the enemy. Don't climb with him at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your dive. Hit once, hit hard, and climb away. The tactic became known as boom and zoom. At altitude, the jug was a monster. Its turbo-supercharged engine gave it lungs where German fighters struggled to breathe. In a dive, its massive weight turned gravity into a weapon. A P-47, dropping from 30,000 feet, could hit speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than anything the Luftwaffe could match. The Germans tried to follow. They learned quickly that it was a deadly mistake. At those speeds, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs began to shake apart or lose control. The jug, heavy and solid, only grew steadier. Now the Americans had found their rhythm. Squadrons of Thunderbolts climbed high above German formations, then dove like hawks, spitting streams of .50 caliber fire into their prey before zooming back to safety. One pass, one kill. That became the doctrine. And as the pilots gained confidence, something else happened. They stopped fearing the Luftwaffe. Instead of the rookies being mocked, it was the Germans who began to mutter nervously when they saw the fat silhouettes overhead. One Luftwaffe pilot later admitted, "We had laughed at them, but when they came from above in numbers, we did not laugh anymore." The numbers told the truth. By late 1943, kill ratios were swinging in favor of the Thunderbolt. More and more American aces were making their names in the jug. Robert Johnson, Francis Gabby Gabreski, Dave Schilling. Each proved that when flown with brains and discipline, the Thunderbolt wasn't just survivable, it was lethal. The jug had been a clumsy rookie. Now it was a confident predator. And soon it would become something even more terrifying, a relentless hunter that turned the skies of Europe into killing grounds. By late 1943, the laughter was gone. The Luftwaffe, once so quick to mock the flying milk bottle, now dreaded the sound of its arrival. A squadron of P-47s diving out of the sun brought with it not just speed and fury, but the terrifying thunder of 8 .50 caliber guns spitting death at 6,000 rounds per minute. What made the jug so terrifying was not just its firepower, but the sheer math of destruction. With 3,400 rounds of ammunition per aircraft, a flight of Thunderbolts could saturate the sky with lead for over half a minute. German fighters, with their limited cannon ammunition, couldn't begin to match that volume of fire. The results were devastating. In October 1943, during raids over Bremen and Emden, the Thunderbolts tore into German formations, ripping apart Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs with brutal efficiency. Pilots who once joked about the jug's size now watched in awe as its guns shredded aircraft into flaming wreckage. Robert Johnson, Francis Gabby Gabreski, and Dave Schilling, names that would soon become legendary, used the jug's strengths to perfection. One pass, one kill, again and again, they proved that when flown aggressively and intelligently, the Thunderbolt was nearly unstoppable. The Luftwaffe began to notice. Pilots who had once sneered at the P-47 started requesting reinforcements whenever they encountered it. Some even refused to engage when large formations of jugs appeared overhead. And the Thunderbolt wasn't just dominating in the air. Its rugged design and heavy load capacity allowed it to dive into new roles, strafing trains, smashing convoys, and pounding German airfields. Its nickname, Jug, took on new meaning. It wasn't just a jug of milk, it was a juggernaut, flattening everything in its path. One German officer summed it up bitterly. The Americans have built a fighter that is also a bomber, a machine that can kill us in the air and destroy us on the ground. For the Americans, the transformation was electrifying. The rookies who once feared the Luftwaffe were now hunting them. The sky itself seemed to tilt in favor of the Allies, as the Jug carved its reputation, one kill at a time. The Germans had laughed. They had mocked. They had dismissed the Jug as clumsy and useless. But by the end of 1943, the laughter had turned to silence, and the silence to fear. The Thunderbolt had awakened, and the skies of Europe would never be the same. In the spring of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots had mocked the P-47. They called it names: the flying milk bottle, the pregnant cow, even the freight train with wings. They joked that American pilots were bringing farm machinery into the skies of Europe. By 1944, no one was laughing. Reports from German squadrons painted a grim new picture. "The Thunderbolt," one ace wrote bitterly, "is not an airplane. It is a flying fortress in miniature. You shoot, and still it comes at you." What terrified them most wasn't just the Jug's toughness, it was the relentlessness of American tactics. The Luftwaffe had always prided itself on individual skill, on the sharpness of its veteran aces. But the P-47 came at them in numbers. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of Jugs filling the sky. Each one carried more guns than most German aircraft. Each one could dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe had in its arsenal, and each one could take punishment that would have destroyed a Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. By the time American pilots mastered the boom and zoom tactics, the Germans were facing a nightmare equation: outnumbered, outgunned, and unable to win on endurance. Even worse, the Thunderbolt's reach was growing. With new drop tanks, the Jug could escort bombers deeper into enemy territory. German aces who once stalked B-17 formations with ease suddenly found themselves attacked from above by P-47s that seemed to appear out of nowhere. One Luftwaffe veteran described the shift with brutal honesty. "At first we thought they were fools. Then we thought they were lucky. Now we understand. They have built a machine that is better than ours, and they have thousands of them. We cannot win." The psychological toll was immense. Many German pilots admitted privately that they felt despair when facing formations of Thunderbolts. Some began avoiding combat altogether if they spotted the Jugs overhead. For the Americans, this reversal was profound. A year earlier, their pilots had felt like lambs to the slaughter. Now they were the hunters, and the Luftwaffe was the prey. The Jug had gone from joke to nightmare. And as 1944 dawned, it was about to unleash its full potential, not just as a fighter, but as a weapon of total destruction against Germany's war machine on the ground. For every German pilot who faced a P-47 in the skies, there was a factory worker in the United States who had made it possible. The real story of the Juggernaut wasn't just its power or toughness. It was the astonishing ability of America to build thousands of them, faster than Germany could shoot them down. The Republic Aviation Plant in Farmingdale, New York, became a symbol of this industrial might. Day and night, the assembly lines clattered, producing fuselages, wings, and engines in a rhythm that never stopped. At its peak, Republic turned out one Thunderbolt every 53 minutes. By war's end, more than 15,000 would roll off the lines, making the P-47 one of the most produced American fighters of the war. Compare that to Germany. The Luftwaffe was losing over 1,000 fighters a month by 1944, but its factories could replace only a fraction of them. Skilled labor was scarce, raw materials were dwindling, and Allied bombers were hammering production centers. Even as German engineers worked wonders on paper, jet fighters, rocket planes, radical new designs, the Reich simply couldn't keep pace. Meanwhile, in America, production only accelerated. Men and women, many of them new to industrial work, learned to rivet, weld, and wire. Housewives, students, and retirees joined the workforce. Rosie the Riveter became not just a slogan, but a reality. In Republic's hangars, women assembled engines the size of automobiles, while others tested 50-caliber machine guns before they were shipped overseas. And the supply chain behind the Jug was staggering. Aluminum smelters in Tennessee, Pratt Whitney engine plants in Connecticut, machine shops across the Midwest, thousands of companies produced parts that converged into a single machine, the Thunderbolt. This was America's true weapon. Not a single plane, but an entire system that could outproduce, outship, and outreplace anything the Axis powers could dream of. German ace Johannes Steinhoff once admitted his disbelief. We destroyed dozens of them, but always there were more, always more. And that was the heart of it. Every time a Jug went down in flames over Europe, another rolled out of Farmingdale, ready to take its place. The Luftwaffe's brilliance, its veteran aces, its tactical edge, all of it meant nothing against the tidal wave of machines America could unleash. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a fighter, it was proof that in modern war, industry was the ultimate weapon. The Germans were discovering that lesson the hard way. And the Jug was only getting started, because its role was about to expand from fighter to executioner on the ground. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had already carved its reputation in the skies, but its true value to the Allies was only beginning to unfold. The U.S. Joint Army Air Forces faced two desperate needs: protect the massive bomber streams of B-17s and B-24s on their deep strikes into Germany, smash the German war machine on the ground, its trains, convoys, supply depots, and armored divisions. The P-47, surprisingly, was perfect for both. At first, the Thunderbolt's short range was a problem. Bomber crews flying into Germany called their escorts the fair weather friends. The Jugs could only stick with them part of the way before turning back for England, leaving the bombers exposed. But with the addition of external drop tanks, the Jugs' reach expanded. Suddenly, formations of Thunderbolts were plunging deep into the Reich, diving into Luftwaffe formations before they could tear into the bomber streams. A dozen Jugs, roaring out of the sun, could scatter an entire German squadron. The once invulnerable Luftwaffe hunters now became the hunted. If the Germans thought the Jug was terrifying in the air, they soon discovered it was even worse on the ground. With its massive weight and rugged frame, the P-47 could carry bombs, rockets, and fuel tanks that most fighters couldn't dream of hauling. It became a flying artillery piece, screaming down on rail yards, blasting locomotives, torching convoys, and hammering tanks with armor-piercing 50-caliber fire. German soldiers gave it a new nickname, Der Schlachter, the Butcher. The destruction was merciless. Thunderbolt pilots prowled highways and railroads, turning supply lines into twisted wreckage. They strafed columns until nothing moved. They bombed bridges, factories, and fuel dumps with cold efficiency. One German tanker recalled the terror of hearing the growl of a Jug overhead. It was worse than artillery. You never knew where they would strike, and when they struck, nothing survived. In the end, this dual role made the Thunderbolt indispensable. By day, it was the shield that kept bombers alive. By afternoon, it was the hammer that pounded Germany's lifelines into dust. It wasn't graceful like the Spitfire. It didn't have the long-legged elegance of the P-51 Mustang. But in sheer, destructive impact, the Thunderbolt stood alone. It was the Jug, the clumsy cow that became both guardian angel and executioner, rewriting the rules of what a fighter could do. When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first clawed its way into Europe's skies in 1943, it was greeted with ridicule. German pilots laughed at its bulk, its awkward lines, its clumsy climb. Even some American and British pilots doubted it, whispering that the flying milk bottle was a disaster waiting to happen. 2 years later, nobody was laughing. The P-47 had proven itself as one of the toughest, most devastating fighters of the Second World War. It had taken rookies and turned them into aces. It had carried men home in aircraft riddled with holes, scarred with fire, engines half destroyed but still running. It had shown that brute strength, properly wielded, could triumph over elegance. In the skies, it broke the back of the Luftwaffe. Its boom and zoom tactics, its unmatched dive speed, and its 850 caliber guns turned air combat into a slaughterhouse. On the ground, it became the Germans' nightmare, smashing tanks, tearing apart convoys, torching trains, and cutting the arteries of Hitler's war machine. But perhaps its greatest legacy lay not just in its performance, but in what it symbolized. The Thunderbolt was not the product of a single genius or a secret weapon. It was the embodiment of American industry and determination, built by the tens of thousands, flown by young men barely out of school, maintained by mechanics working around the clock, and powered by factories that stretched from Detroit to Connecticut. It was the hammer of a democracy that had decided it would not lose. German aces had mocked it. German propaganda dismissed it. But in the end, they could not escape it. The Jug was everywhere, in the skies over France, in the fields of Italy, over the hedgerows of Normandy, across the bridges of the Rhine. For the pilots who flew it, the Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It was a trusted companion, a protector, a brute force friend that would take them into hell and bring them back again. And for the Luftwaffe, it was the cruelest of ironies. The fighter they had laughed at had become the fighter they feared most. From joke to nightmare, from flying milk bottle to flying legend, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had written its name in history with fire and steel. And long after the laughter had faded, the Jug's thunder still echoed across the skies of memory. And now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think about the P-47 Thunderbolt's journey? From being laughed at as a flying milk bottle to becoming one of the most feared fighters of the war. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next untold tale from World War II, stories of courage, machines, and the people who changed history. I'll see you in the next episode.